Hi, so we're going to talk very briefly about getting Python and TensorFlow installed. I was going to put this up a couple days ago. Part of it is that I had a bunch of craziness occur. Part of it is that I kind of wasn't satisfied with the version I had. So very briefly, before we go over the stuff that's coming, there is some discussion about whether we want y'all to use the virtual lab or to set up Python on your own systems. So there are a lot of reasons that we would prefer the virtual lab. The concern is some of the data sets that we'll be using are very large, and if you're going to be training non-trivial neural networks on full sci-far, that would require you to put hundreds of megabytes of data in place and then heavily utilize the machine for hours, conceivably. And that just kind of might not be feasible, right? So we're still kind of trying to figure out if we want to go through the hassle of trying to get everybody to sort of set up TensorFlow on their own systems, or if we want to find some way to use the virtual system. Here's a short discussion, basically, of the environment that I recommend setting it up. And if we ultimately decide we're going to do it this way, I'll do a video showing me installing it on Windows, just so you can be walked through that. So basically, getting everything installed is a little bit tricky. Python itself is easy. There is just a binary Python installer for Windows. There are also a bunch of high-quality Python distributions that are Windows compatible. By Python distribution, we basically just mean a bundle of Python and then a bunch of other software, right? The frustrating part is all of like the mathy stuff that we're going to be using, right? So NumPy, which TensorFlow depends on. So TensorFlow depends on NumPy. NumPy depends on BLAS, where BLAS is a library that's written in C and Fortran. Getting BLAS installed on Windows is potentially very irritating, right? It's not very hard on Linux. It's annoying on Windows. TensorFlow GPU, if you wanted to try that, is going to depend on getting CUDA set up, and similarly, CUDA. So I've had people disagree with me about how irritating this is. I find getting CUDA installed irritating. One of the reasons is that there's sort of a very careful, like, specific versions of CUDA only support specific versions of GPU. So, like, recent versions of CUDA don't support old GPUs. I should say, CUDA is one of the things that helps deploy neural networks to NVIDIA GPUs. So if you have an old GPU, you have to use an old version of CUDA, but then certain versions of TensorFlow only map to certain versions of CUDA, and so you have this very annoying sort of support matrix that you have to decode to figure out what the newest version of TensorFlow you can get is and what the newest version of CUDA you can get is, and it's just irritating. We don't want to have to mess with it. So we might also want other stuff. Matplotlib, IPython, and Spider are all other Python libraries we're going to want. Installing them is not hard, it's just a hassle that we don't need to have to deal with every time, right? So what methods for handling all of this? Method one is just to be on Linux, right? Because a lot of these tools work very well on Linux. Then it's easy to set up a virtual environment, which is like a little per project package cache that you can use so that you can install your dependencies, your libraries in that and not mess up the global cache. Then you can update a couple of tools because it's probable that like the versions of pip and setup tools and wheel that you'll start out with are old. And then you can just use pip install to install pip being the normal Python package manager, right? Official as of version 3 point something, 4 or 5, I think. And then you can also install Spider and IPython and whatever else you want. This works pretty well, and it looks like this. You just have to sort of run these commands. Oops. But there is a problem. So there's some problems with this. So an advantage is that this is easy. Whoops. Come on, slides. So this is easy for a certain definition of easy. It might seem like a lot of extra work the first time I ask you to do it, but the first time you mess up an environment, and if you're using a virtual environment, you can just delete it, right? If you've been installing everything in the global package cache and you mess up, you're in trouble, but if you've been using a virtual environment and you mess up, just erase it and start over. It's standard, right? All of these features come with built-in base Python, so you don't have to install anything special. And it's what I do. So if you have a problem with it, I can help you. The disadvantage is, what if you're not on Linux, right? Method 1, be on Linux. So if you're not on Linux, then this is useless to you. And if you're not familiar with Linux, you would then have to be learning enough Linux to do this, and you'd have to have somewhere to install Linux. So, whoops. So I don't want to make this as much a class. I do not want to make this as much a class on Linux as on TensorFlow. So what do we do if you're on Windows? Well, if you're on Windows, then hypothetically you can install the Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, and then install a Linux distribution, and then install Python in it, and then just meet up with these steps here. So the potential advantages of doing that are you'd basically still be able to use the Linux instructions I'm familiar with, but you wouldn't have to install Linux all of the time. Disadvantages are you'd still have to learn some Linux from this, and WSL and Debian, for example, is probably not going to be small. It's not going to be huge. It's not going to be small. Order of 4 or 5 gigabytes, I think. All right, so that's still kind of crazy, right? Options 1 and 2 have some notable disadvantages. So here's option 3, which is the one that I recommend if you are on Windows, and that is to use a thing called Anaconda. Anaconda is a fairly common Python distribution for scientific computing. So what it is, conveniently for us, is a bundle of Python and then a whole bunch of other stuff that is common in scientific computing environments. And then it has a sort of large package repository of more stuff that it doesn't ship by default. So it's fairly easy to install components we want that it doesn't ship with by default. So by default, it's going to include Spider, it's going to include IPython. I think it even includes VS Code, even though it's not a Python thing. And it's fairly easy to install TensorFlow. You basically just have to create an Anaconda environment, which has fairly simple tools to do, and then set up an environment and just tell it to include TensorFlow in the environment, and you're pretty much good to go. It'll sort everything out. It also integrates nicely with Windows. So one nice thing about this is that after you've done everything correctly, you would be able to just pin Spider in the TensorFlow environment onto your start menu. So you just have a button thereafter that you would just click and you would get Spider, right? Where Spider, if you don't remember, is this thing. Whoopsie. This guy is Spider, right? So at the end of the day, if you use the Anaconda route, you would just have a button for Spider on your start menu. You could just push and then get this. And so I think that's, if we do decide to have you set up Python on your home systems, that's going to be the easiest way to do it. It might long-term save us some effort if you go ahead and start trying to do this. Let me know if the process of installing Anaconda and then setting up a TensorFlow environment, let me know how easy that is to do, right? Hopefully most of us can get it sorted. Hopefully everybody can get that installed and we'll be able to do that. If you have a lot of trouble with it or you don't think you're going to be able to get it to work, then please do let me know. My West Georgia email should be up soon. And we'll try to also get something set up on the virtual lab. Okay. Yep. So, oh yeah, a bunch of the nice things about this approach, right? So one of the big nice things is this thing is, I believe, fairly common in industry, right? So, oops. Sample size of 2, but I've heard glowing appraisals of Anaconda and Spider from, people who operate in industry. It also has a fairly easy glide path to getting NumPy and TensorFlow and everything set up on Windows, although I have not tried to get TensorFlow GPU set up. I don't know if they distribute Conda. Disadvantages, I haven't used it very much. I usually work just from an Xterm with a text editor. I'm, whatever, old and crotchety. I mean, not that old, but minimalist. So I'm not as familiar with Spider. So there's going to be a couple of times you were going to ask me reasonable questions about Conda and Spider, and I'm just not going to know. Because I haven't used it as much as I've used Vim and Xterm. So it'll be a little bit of a learning experience for me, too. Okay, so that's hopefully... So we'll either be using Anaconda on Windows, or we're going to be using the virtual environment that West Georgia provides, and we'll figure that out.